The Biblical History Wall Hangings is a series of works about biblical history, Jewish history in the biblical period that I created beginning in 1992. I worked on the series until 1998. The series consists of 10 wall hangings. I chose the medium of wall hangings for two reasons. First of all, because I could make the works very large, and of course, Jewish history loomed very large in my mind, and I could also use a lot of different mediums in creating the wall hangings. And second, because by 1992, when I began the Biblical History series, I had already spent 5 years creating my Holocaust wall hangings, and it was my idea that I would create a new series that covered all of Jewish history, of which the Holocaust wall hangings would become a part. Well, by 1998, I realized that having to work 12 to 16-hour days for months on end on each wall hanging, I would never be able to finish all of Jewish history in a series. So I decided in 1998 to call it a day and just rename my Jewish history series as the Biblical History Wall Hangings. The Biblical History Wall Hangings were started with Abraham's journey. Abraham is known as Avraham Avinu, our forefather. He was born in Ur Kasdim, which is in today's southern Iraq, and he grew up among people who believed in all sorts of gods. Abraham is supposed to be the first one who believed in only one God. God commanded Abraham to leave his father's house and go to the land that God would show him, the land that God promised to Abraham and to his descendants forever. And my wall hangings, Abraham's Journey, shows the path that Abraham took from his birthplace in Ur Kasdim to Haran, which is in modern-day Turkey, and then to the land of Canaan, which is today's Israel. The next wall hanging is called Exodus, and it shows the path that the Israelites took out of Egypt through the desert on their way to the land of Canaan. They were being led by Moses, because when the descendants of Abraham, his great-grandchildren, initially went to Egypt, it was because there was a famine in Israel. There was a drought, and they went to Egypt because they could sustain themselves there. And they had a brother, Joseph, who was a high official in the Egyptian government. And so they went to Egypt, and for a number of years they were well treated, but eventually they were enslaved by the Egyptians, and they spent many years being slaves until Moses freed them from slavery and brought them through the desert to the land of Canaan. And this map shows the path they took through the desert all the way to the land of Canaan. The next map shows where the tribes of Israel settled once they reached the land of Canaan. These images are based on Jacob's blessing of his sons. Each son had a symbol in Jacob's blessing, and I used those in creating this artwork. The next two works show the path that the Jews had to take when they were exiled. First of all, they were exiled from Israel to Assyria. That was because Assyria was the predominant power in the Middle East in the 8th century before the Christian era. And this map shows the Assyrian Empire and the path that the Israelites took. At that time, Israel was a separate kingdom from Judah. The two kingdoms were established after King Solomon, and the Assyrians conquered Israel, where 10 of the tribes lived. And so the 10 tribes were forced into exile in Assyria, and these are known as the 10 lost tribes. The next work is called Babylonian Exile, and that was the exile of the people who lived in Judah in the 6th century before the Christian era. They were conquered by Babylon and forced to go to Babylon. And this shows the Babylonian Empire in the background, and I superimposed on the Babylonian map an image of the Tower of Babel, which is well known, and the path of the people who went there. The images are all block printed on separate pieces of fabric and then appliqued onto the background. The next wall hanging is called Return to Zion, and it shows the different waves of Aliyah that happened after Persia conquered the Babylonian exile, the Babylonian Empire, and allowed the Jews to return. The Jews returned in waves, and eventually they built the Second Temple, which was later destroyed by the Romans. As you recall, the First Temple was built by King Solomon. The Second Temple was built by the people who returned from Babylon after Persia conquered Babylon, and King Cyrus was kind enough to allow the people to return to their homeland. The next work is Masada, which is by far the largest wall hanging I ever created. It's about 20 feet long. I made such a big, long wall hanging for two reasons. First of all, Masada, which is where the Jews defended themselves against the Romans after the Romans had destroyed the Second Temple. They decided at the end to commit suicide rather than fall in the hands of the Romans and be exiled to Rome. And this was always regarded when I was growing up as a high point in Jewish history. And I wanted to have a work that was large enough so I could pay tribute to each of the 960 people who committed suicide at Masada. So on this work, I have 960 figures which I carved and block printed and appliqued onto the background. The next work is called Steps in the Creation of the Diaspora. It's an overview of the dispersion of the Jews, of their expulsion. The first one during the Babylonian period, and then during the Greek period, and then in the Roman period. And it shows that with each expulsion or migration, the Jews went further and further away from their land. The final two wall hangings are about the history of Jerusalem. One is called O Jerusalem, and the other is called If I Forget Thee. The idea in both works is the same, and that is to show the history of Jerusalem as a mountain consisting of archaeological layers in proportion to the period in which usually a foreign power was in control of Jerusalem. In the first work, O Jerusalem, I created these layers by means of appliquing different fabrics, each fabric representing a different period in the history of Jerusalem. In the second work, in If I Forget Thee, I decided instead of appliquing different fabrics, I would create block prints, and I block printed each layer with a different carved block so that you can see the long history of Jerusalem, and you see the city of Jerusalem in today's Israel perched on top of this very big mountain. I've been asked what I learned from creating the biblical history wall hangings. And I think what I learned is something that I already knew, and that is that there's a very strong bond between the Jewish people and the land of Israel.